Most of us, of course, realize that tomorrow is Memorial Day. And in honor of the occasion this week, I tried to get online and research Memorial Day. I knew that it was first initiated due to the Civil War. I knew that it was originally called Decoration Day, as a day set apart to decorate the graves of those fallen in battle. But I got online because I wanted to get more facts about the memorial, more background. Unfortunately, I was very disappointed. There's more myth concerning the conception of Memorial Day than there is factual evidence. There were precedents for the holiday in the South as early as 1861 and in the North as early as 1863. By 1874, some in the South had begun adding the word Confederate to their daily services, effectively initiating a Confederate Memorial Day to distinguish it from just any old Memorial Day. That was done because there were women in the South who believed that the North had somehow misappropriated their day. By the early 20th century, the day had become an opportunity for veterans, politicians, and ministers alike to commemorate the Civil War and to rehash the atrocities of the enemy from 40 years earlier. In 1967, the Uniform Monday Holiday Act moved Memorial Day from its traditional date of May 30th to the last Monday of May. And veterans have complained the move has caused the younger generations to have a tendency to forget the purpose of Memorial Day and make it a day for games, races, and revelry instead of a day of memory and tears. In a similar manner, the VFW complained in 2002, changing that date merely to create 3-day weekends has undermined the very meaning of the day. No doubt this has contributed a lot to the general public's nonchalant observance of Memorial Day. Now, in 1920, the National American Legion adopted the poppy to represent Memorial Day as its official flower. But even that is not as straightforward as it may seem. After the Second Battle of Ypres in World War I, Canadian Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae wrote the poem In Flanders Fields. The poem refers to the poppies so abundant around the graves of those lost in that long battle. Hence, the poppy comes from a foreign battlefield in a war which came 50 years later than the Civil War and which did not pit brother against brother. And the poem from which the lines are taken was written by a Canadian. So it should be obvious that most of those things speak more to the legend than they do to the actual day and facts of Memorial Day. Sadly, those are the things on which legends are built. Sadder still, those are the things which overshadow the true legacy until it is nearly forgotten. Of course, that forgetfulness is not immediate, but it is evident whenever veterans, politicians, and yes, even ministers use the circumstances of the day simply as a means to get atop their proverbial soapboxes. Or when a somber tradition to honor the fallen is somehow lost to the revelry of the day. And when a poem from another war on different soil fought by all the nations of the world has come to symbolize the strife between brothers. And we see forgetfulness when instead of drawing all men together in our loss, there is instead found a feud over whose memorial it really is. And we see forgetfulness and loss of legacy when the memorial is no longer really the memorial it was established to be. Sadly, Memorial Day is no longer the memorial it was once intended. Its legacy is lost, even to those who would try to research it and hunt down its meaning. And that's the kind of thing man has done since the very beginning of time. He will discard a valid memorial to service for nothing more than a holiday to be spent in the pleasant revelries of life. He translates that which was intended as a somber memorial into that which is more inviting, more user-friendly, and more in keeping with the joyous mood of his day. The legacy is taken in a different direction than its founders ever considered or conceived. This morning, as we turn again to Ruth to complete our series on this beautiful love story, we also find that of which legends are made. The difference is here we find the memory recorded, that all generations may remember, and the memory will not be corrupted. This morning, we will focus on the 4th chapter of Ruth, and we'll consider the memorable choices which leave a legacy. To do so, we will pick up right where we left off last week, the 18th and last verse of chapter 3. Then she said, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today." Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat. Then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, but if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." And then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." Focus on those two words. His inheritance. The closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself because it will jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." And the first thing we have to note about the choices which leave a legacy is the choices which leave a legacy are serious choices. These are the kinds of choices which have real, measurable implications for our lives and for the lives of those around us. And that needs to be said and needs to be understood, because in this world of social media, where everyone shares every moment of every day and everything of every moment with everyone, including strangers from far away, we tend to believe that everything about our lives is of vast importance and of real consequence. We tend to believe that every single decision, thought, spoken word, or activity is as equally important as the last or the next. Nearly 2 months ago, I had to go to Kernersville to get license plates because there are so few license bureaus open. And that's the irony of man's way to prevent the spread of a pandemic, that we force crowds into a few places instead of letting people scatter into many places. Where there's an even greater risk of exposure. But anyway, I was forced to wait in line as long as I have ever had to wait for license plates. And while I was standing in line, it certainly seemed troublesome, frustrating, and earth-shattering to my schedule. But tomorrow, will anyone really care that I was bored standing in line waiting for license plates, whipped out my phone, and texted to everybody I know, "I can't believe this week"? What's happened in my life may seem to be big news, but is the fact that I was behind schedule and had to run out of the house without breakfast ever really going to make it to a UPI newswire? In the grand tapestry, which is our lives, will anyone remember that the highlight of my Tuesday evening this past week was watching a rerun of Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble meeting the Great Gazoo? Our society tries to lay great importance on such trivial matters, but while we make a myriad of such choices and do a myriad of such insignificant things every day, they are not the things upon which biographies are based, and nor should they be. The legacy of our lives needs to be about serious choices we make, choices concerning our growth, our character, and how we live up to the internal standards we have come to accept. No one needs to know what brand of toilet paper or what flavor toothpaste we've purchased. And quite honestly, few really care. So we must first understand the serious choices are choices we must face. The intrinsic choices of our lives, those which will live long after us, are not the choices we make without any real consideration. They are the choices which have to be faced, and often have to be faced in the light of potential cost and risk. I love Shakespeare's quote from Act 2 of the 12th Night. Be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. And such is the tapestry and the legacy of our lives, that much of what we have is that into which we were born. Some, through diligence, hard work, and perseverance, may move beyond even the most humble of beginnings, and others are simply singled out when great need arises. But the problem with so many of us is that we simply do not understand the difference between the choices which prove greatness and the choices which prove our common link with all men. Accordingly, we may not be willing to risk greatness even when it comes our way, because we don't recognize the choice demanded as particularly significant or of great import. But we will never create a lasting legacy simply making common choices on a host of insignificant issues. But sadly, too often we are too busy with all the insignificant decisions of our lives that we fail to take into account the weightier matters. To build a legacy, we must face our choices when they appear. You know, I love Naomi's conclusion to her talk with Ruth. The man will not rest until he has settled it today. And the hard truth is, if we're going to build a legacy, there is no time like the present. We need to get started on it. We need to act on it. We need to do it right now. As we said last week, Boaz has probably thought through the possibilities. He's undoubtedly aware of his obligation. He has been kind, gracious, and even generous to Ruth. But now the real weight of what must be done is upon him. He can no longer delay. He cannot feign ignorance of the situation. The whole of the harvest from the time he first saw Ruth has been building to this moment in time. He simply must respond. And so it is in our lives. We can spend a whole lot of our lives simply going along, biding our time, taking care of the everyday tasks, even being kind, gracious, and perhaps generous. But eventually we all come to the point where we make the decision to move ahead or to fall back. And that decision may be one for which there is no second chance. That decision may be the difference between leaving a legacy and simply leaving. So to build a legacy, we must act. Now, of course, we all realize that the chapter and verse markings are not inspired, and as is so often the case, the chapter break between Naomi's words and Boaz's action is unfortunate. There can be very little doubt that Boaz was approaching the gate as Ruth was approaching Naomi with the 6 measures of grain. Action manufactures the building blocks of a legacy. Action takes us first where we need to be. Boaz went to the gate, for that was where such civil matters were handled. He still had grain to thresh, he still had workers in the field, but he interrupts his daily activities to face that which will not rest. Action takes us to those we need to see. You know, as soon as he sees the kinsman passing by, he calls him over. The kinsman would recognize that this was not just for a friendly chat. He's at the gate of the city. Civil matters are addressed here. This is like coming to court. It's not happenstance. It's not something that just occurs. It's planned, premeditated, and inspired. Third, action makes our position clear. Boaz felt impelled to call 10 of the city elders to witness the transaction. 2 or 3 were all that were legally required, but there was to be absolutely no doubt about Boaz's position when it was over. Action moves us beyond delay. Elimelech probably rented his inheritance to others when he left for Moab, but Elimelech has passed, and his heirs have passed. Naomi can no longer profit from the land, so she is faced with the need to sell Elimelech's inheritance. But further delay will only further impoverish Naomi. The time has come for a resolution to the situation. And action requires courage. You know, even today in the 21st century, real estate is the one sure money maker in the world. The Redeemer kinsman would need the courage to take the risk to add to his own holdings. It might make him, as Boaz is described, a man of great wealth. But courage is needed, for there is a risk, and action may require a serious risk in our lives. You know, the kinsman redeemer, whether Boaz or the other relative, would have to pay for the land. But in also being required to take Ruth and raise offspring for Elimelech, a kinsman redeemer would later have to leave that parcel to any specific children of that union. In effect, the redeemer must pay for the land, which may deplete his own cash reserves, only to give the land back when the child comes of age. It is a risky financial venture, but talk is cheap. And it's how we respond in deed which will establish our legacy. And so while the serious choice must be faced, the choices of legacy are choices we willingly make. Verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption of the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. And he removed his sandal. You know, one of man's most basic failings is to go into any kind of endeavor with a bit of reservation still hovering in his mind. We're often hindered in our deeds by the question, but what if it doesn't work out? Or what will it cost me? Or what is the profit for me? Or is it really worth the risk? Boaz shows that the choices which form our legacy hold no such reservation. We go in willingly, we go in wholeheartedly, and we go in. We willingly risk when we're convinced of two things. One, that the risk meets our obligations. And two, that the risk is within the will of God for our lives. Only then will we willingly take on all the ramifications, the issues, and any complications which may later arise. The man who was dean of camp for a dozen years in which I served was also a foster parent. At least one of his foster children asked to be legally adopted. And he agreed and adopted the child. Just a year or two after the adoption, that child was in a skirmish with the law. On Wednesday of our week at camp, the dean was conspicuously absent. He had left the camp to stand beside his adopted child in court. I'm sure he never expected that complication, but it did not matter. He had adopted the child, and he served and proved himself a true father. Boaz would have faced the same risk that the other kinsman redeemer would have faced. He will invest in the land which is not his, but that of any offspring the union may produce. And he does so without reservation. Verse 9, Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. For Boaz, the only reservation in his mind is the delay in the passing of the sandal. He's already set for what's to happen. I have bought all that belonged to Elimelech. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth. And why? To take her as a wife, to raise up an heir to his holdings, not to raise up an heir to my holdings, my property, my name, but to raise up a child who can reclaim that which belonged to his forefathers. Boaz shows us a legacy is never about looking back, but neither is a legacy about making a name for ourselves. A legacy is about leaving a mark which makes a difference. Boaz was more concerned about the name of Elimelech being forgotten and Naomi being bereft of all support than he was about the risk to himself. And so to Shakespeare's quote, we should add one from John W. Gardner, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Some have greatness thrust upon them. Few have excellence thrust upon them. They achieve it. They do not achieve it unwittingly by doing what comes naturally, and they don't stumble into it in the course of amusing themselves. All excellence involves discipline and tenacity. We see that as we consider the legacy we may leave to our children or our grandchildren. We work hard to put back a good nest egg. We scrimp and save to have something material to leave behind. But what about our spiritual legacy? What are we leaving behind in the wake of our spiritual testimony? As adopted sons of God, we need to be aware of the legacy we leave in the realm of the spiritual. For that alone will be an eternal legacy. The kind of difference we make is the kind of difference that will affect generations to come. But what kind of generation or what kind of difference have we really made with our lives in the lives of others? Secondly, the choices which leave a legacy are the choices which elevate and do not shame. Such choices are those which have an edifying effect on the people around us. They're choices which are for good. They may be meant for good for just the individual or for the society, but they are ultimately good for all involved, including the kingdom of God. The point of the kinsman redeemer was that none of Israel would be lost, but that means more than property. The whole of Israel was important to our God. There was no such thing as essential Israelites and non-essential Israelites. In God's scheme, the shepherd was just as important as the judge, the farmer just as important as the king. The Danite was just as essential as the Judean. And their law imposed censure against those who were simply not willing to redeem. Deuteronomy 25. If the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then she shall go to the elders and say, he is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. Now I'm going to tell you, that's a legal system you've got to love. If you're going to shame me, you're going to be shamed forever. And as if that was not enough to cause endless conversation, in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. For the rest of his days, the legacy of the kinsman redeemer who shamed his brother's widow would be regarded as one who stands outside the command of God. God, through Mosaic law, was very serious about legacy. He wanted all men remembered and all men brought forward. And he's no less serious today. We're to leave a mark upon this world which proves the legacy granted to us through our own adoption into the family of God. We're to elevate and not to shame those around us. Ruth 4, verse 11. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. Our choices elevate when our choices are godly choices. Aside from avoiding an ugly confrontation with an angry widow, Boaz makes a willing choice to be even more gracious than he's been to date. He surely considered the cost. He's willingly offering his home, his money, himself to a young widow and any child she may produce. Yes, there's love involved. Boaz is obviously pleased with the young widow's desire for him. But Boaz is equally in love with the laws of his heavenly Father and the welfare of his society, his community, his people. And so our godly choices speak to a godly legacy. And while the people cannot possibly realize all the ramifications of all they are asking from the Lord, we should. Rachel and Leah were literally the mothers of 2/3 of Israel. Those two women actually gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Their maids in their names were responsible for the other 4 sons, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. God blessed Jacob greatly through his wives, and he blessed Jacob's wives because of the patriarch's relationship to him. Ephrathah was the area surrounding Bethlehem. The people were asking that the Lord make Boaz a great man in the city, but also in a surrounding area. Now, for those of us here, well, nobody's here this morning except me, but for those of us who would normally be here in Germantown, we can understand it by thinking of a man who comes to greatness in Germantown. Maybe he opens a little corner store at the end of Friendship Road. But then he becomes a fixture in Stokes County. And once he's a fixture in Stokes County, maybe he extends to the Triad. And maybe once he becomes important in the Triad, he can extend to the statewide level or the national level or an international level. The people want Boaz's faithfulness to be rewarded in a great way. They wish to see that reward in his extension. Perez, Judah's son through the incestuous relationship with Tamar, became the driving force of the tribe of Judah. He's not merely one of 12. He outdistances all the other heirs of Judah, including his twin brother. Perez becomes the very representation of the Lion of Judah. And that people are asking that any child from this union may also represent that kind of legacy. They want God to provide another real leader through Boaz's faithfulness. And remember that. They want to see another lion arise because of Boaz. And so naturally our choices elevate when God is allowed to work through them. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. There it is. The gamble is paid off. Elimelech has an heir. His name will not be forgotten in Israel. Verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, not to Ruth, but to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. You see, the son is what makes the difference. They pray that the son will become famous. It's the son who is seen as the Redeemer. It's the son who restores Naomi's life. It's the son who will provide for her in her old age. Boaz doesn't even get a mention as an also-ran. His actions, his deeds initiated this whole affair. And he's not mentioned. When God is allowed to work through our choices, it's not about our profit, our graciousness, or even our recognition. It's how we let go and simply allow the Lord to work in our lives, which makes the most of the legacy. And so finally, the choices which leave a legacy are the choices which hold to God. You know, sadly, in this life, the baby may never come. Our tapestry may never seem complete. Our healing may not be seen on this side of heaven. We may never get the recognition we deserve. Other names may always seem to supplant ours. But while those times are difficult, we must allow our God to use our choices in his way. We must trust in his guidance and his hand, for he is the one who marks any real legacy in our lives. Our choices hold to God when his name is praised, and ours lie in obscurity. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, so they named him Obed. And those verses are the very crux of our love story. The Redeemer is not the one who puts everything into motion. The Redeemer is not the one who initiates the events that follow. The Redeemer is the one who claims the inheritance and ensures the continuation of the family name. Naomi is not the child's mother, but it is the child who has redeemed her life. Boaz and Ruth are both afterthoughts. Now, don't get me wrong. They're both remarkable people. They both play critical parts in the story. They're both memorable characters. They both show the nobler traits we should all be striving to develop in our own lives. But in the grand grand scheme of things, they play very minor roles. They may give birth to the Redeemer, but they are not the Redeemer. It's the Son who offers the only promise. It's the blessing of God which makes it possible. Obed's name translates simply as worshiper. And even his name is a memorial to all that God has done. The scripture records all that Ruth and Boaz did. The scripture makes it clear that it was pleasing to the Lord. But the scripture gives the praise to the Father who made it happen. And when we hold to God, our legacy extends our worth. Verse 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Boaz was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. And those verses clearly represent how our legacy can have an impact long after we have parted from this life and this place. 4 of my favorite verses in all of Scripture deal directly with these 4. Matthew 1, beginning in verse 3. And to Judah were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and to Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron Ram, and to Ram was born Amminadab, and to Amminadab Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab, and to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth, and to Obed Jesse, and to Jesse was born David the king, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Now, if you've been here more than one Christmas, you've probably heard me speak, at least in part, on these verses. They are a part of the genealogy of our Lord. And they are absolutely critical to our understanding for several reasons. Matthew is a Jewish author writing to a Jewish audience. The Jews were a patriarchal society. To have even one woman mentioned in such a lineage would be odd, but to have 4 in as many verses is highly unusual. The Jews would question each and every one of these women about their place in this genealogy. Tamar gave birth to Perez and Zerah because of her incestuous relationship with Judah. Rahab was a Canaanite saved from the fall of Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite. And we all remember the adultery and murder which brought her, who had been the wife of Uriah, into David's life. But as we've noted at Christmas, while none of these women may have seemed appropriate to man, God has rewarded them all with a place of honor and with a lasting legacy in the annals of time. And that's why I mentioned a moment ago that the elders of the city could not possibly know or even imagine the blessing for which they are praying. The blessing that the union of Boaz and Ruth would ultimately produce. All 4 of these women have found a legacy in their lives, which extends beyond their lives into the very salvation of all men. Now, it's true, none of these women might be considered the perfect model for the daughters of Israel, but that's not important. What it is important is that we look to their sons, to see what their sons became, to see the legacy which was made possible through elevation and not shame. All 4 women faced risk. Tamar faced stoning because she had she felt betrayed by Judah. Rahab could have been condemned by Jericho and by Israel. Ruth could have been shamed as unworthy. Bathsheba could have been stoned even if her partner was the king. And she did face the notoriety of everyone in Jerusalem knowing her story. But through God's power and graciousness, each of those risks paid huge dividends. As we mentioned, through Perez, Judah became the lion of the 12 tribes. Judah led in war. Judah became the tribe from which all of Israel is known. Through Rahab, the spies sent to Jericho were saved, and a redeemer kinsman was born. Through Ruth, we find the grandfather of the giant slayer, the first king of Jerusalem, and the unifier of the nation. Through Bathsheba, we find the greatest of Israel's kings. And through the whole of their lineage, we find the greatest Redeemer man will ever know. Not one of these women knew what was to come of the legacy of their lives. Not one of these women had any reason to believe their legacy would be special at all. But that's what makes this a great love story. Because it's the story of God's love and a memorial to how he makes the difference and can build a legacy in a life which will never be forgotten. We can't expect our legacy to be any different. Like the legacies of those women, our legacy is not about what we've done or where we've been or even who we are. Our legacy is always about what we are doing, where we are headed, and who we are trying to be. For many, the Memorial Day is not going to be like any other Memorial Day we've ever known. But maybe that's a good thing, as it's certainly more in keeping with the original intent. But maybe from this point on, our lives will not be like they have been. And that can also be a good thing. For the truly memorable events of our lives, which leave a legacy for all who follow, are never merely a matter of maintaining the status quo, nor are they a matter of random amusements. To leave a legacy which will follow us into eternity, we must first build on the foundation of a godly life. Tomorrow, don't think about all the things you would be doing in a normal year. Rather, think about the little unusual things, those decisions which we often make with hard thought and consideration. Those are the things on which we might build a memorial, which no event, circumstance, or man will ever be able to forego.